And I would use all of that to plan how the project would get accomplished. Budgeting is the same thing, whether it is for a business or whether it's for your home. If you think of budgeting, you are making a plan of what to do with your resources with a goal in mind. And again, the goal in mind is financial prosperity. So we are called on to do budgeting in a way that honors God and brings financial prosperity. We look at planning, and I know Ryan has mentioned this, that God was the ultimate planner. Before we were even created, he had a plan for us. He said that the Lamb was slain before the foundations of the world. God had a plan all the way through, and his resources, his Son, was the most valuable thing in existence to him, and he gave that resource to accomplish the plan. So I want to look at a verse in Proverbs that talks a bit about Jesus and God the Father doing some planning. So the whole chapter 8 in the book of Proverbs is a wonderful one to dwell on and read over again and to chew on, to understand the excellence of wisdom. And in verse 12, wisdom starts talking in the first person. In Proverbs 8, verse 12, it begins, I, wisdom. And I would posit, or I would say, that this is the Spirit of Jesus talking. Or if not, it's a spirit of wisdom. It's certainly embodied Jesus and God the Father. But it says, I, wisdom, dwell with prudence, and find out knowledge and discretion. The fear of the Lord is to hate evil. Pride and arrogance in the evil way, and the perverse mouth I hate. Counsel is mine, in sound wisdom. I am understanding, I have strength. By me kings reign, and rulers decree justice. By me princes rule, and nobles, all the judges of the earth. I love those who love me, and those who seek me diligently will find me. Riches and honor are with me. This is wisdom talking. Enduring riches and righteousness. My fruit is better than gold, yes, than fine gold. And my revenue than choice silver. I traverse the way of righteousness in the midst of the paths of justice, that I may cause those who love me to inherit wealth, that I may fill their treasuries. So then, beginning in verse 22, wisdom starts talking about the planning that wisdom did with God himself. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way, before his works of old. I have been established from everlasting, from the beginning, before there was ever an earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no fountains abounding with water. Before the mountains were settled, before the hills I was brought forth. While as yet he had not made the earth or the fields or the primal dust of the world, when he prepared the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he established the clouds above, when he strengthened the fountains of the deep, when he assigned to the sea its limit, so that the waters would not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him as a master craftsman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him, rejoicing in his inhabited world, and my delight was with the sons of men. So we see a picture here of wisdom working with God. And what I want to use that analogy for is that when we're budgeting as a family, it's very, very important for couples, married couples, to do this together. Did you notice that he said when God assigned the sea its limit, so he talks about all the things that God is doing. He said, I was beside him as a master craftsman. It wasn't God alone doing this work. Together, they were working together. And there is a spiritual significance to working on godly ventures with someone else in agreement. And the expression for it is that the work done together is greater than the sum of the parts. In other words, what one could do alone or the other could do alone, put them together, it's not as great as what they can do together. Another example of that, Jesus talked about marriage and said this is an example of he and his church. And we see the analogy here where wisdom was working with God. And then it says he was rejoicing always before him. And you could see the love they have with each other. And then he says, and my delight was with the sons of men. So God had created man in his image. Can you see the analogy of a husband and wife in their delight in their children? And the whole idea here is that as we come in communion, we learn the wisdom that Jesus in wisdom and God had before the foundations of the world. And even as parents, Proverbs says, train up a child in the way they should go, and they will not depart from it. A good description of that is in training the child, you're not training the child necessarily from right or wrong, but as a parent, you're helping that child discover what their destiny is, where they're destined to work, what their career, what their life is going to be like in destiny. And when that is the way they should go, is they should walk in the fullness of the destiny that God's given them to walk in. And as parents, we teach them in the way they should go, and they will not depart from it. So, let's unpack some of this wisdom around budgeting. If we look at budgeting, as I mentioned, it's a plan and there is a goal in mind for budgeting. That goal, again, is financial prosperity. So what does that goal look like when it's in place? So it's good to have a vision of what the goal is, rather than just saying, oh, I need to pay off this loan or this one thing. It's good to have the whole picture in mind of where we're going with this. So A budget based on financial prosperity would include our ability, first of all, to tithe, that we don't have any debt with the possible exception of a mortgage. In addition to having no debt and being able to tithe, we have 3 to 6 months of living expenses in an emergency fund. And finally, two more things. In addition to that, at least 15% of our income goes into investing. And finally, one last thing, and it's important to remember these things, and I'll explain what this is if you don't know what it is. What's called sinking funds where necessary. So, each one of these items we'll start to unpack a little bit. I want to mention too that achieving success in financial prosperity and in budgeting is not measured by how much you make or how much you earn. It is not measured. There's nothing here that measures how much you make or how much you earn. Rather, it's measured on how much godly wisdom you use in managing what you do have. So if there is somebody that works a very low-end job, and I don't know what that would be. They work at a gas station, they're a janitor, etc. You can achieve financial prosperity just as easily as the person making $300,000 a year. And the idea is to implement these. So let's talk about each of these and why they reflect the wisdom that God has given us for managing finances. So first off, the tithe. And I have talked about this on the first night on Saturday night when I began this. This, of all of the things in our budget, is a manifestation of our identity. We were made in God's image, and what that identity includes is we are extravagant givers and we are committed. And that embodies giving in a way that God has suggested that we give, and it also embodies the commitment to your local church. I mentioned too, some people say, well, I tithe and I like to give it to Pat Robertson and et cetera, et cetera. And that's good. I'm not going to judge anybody on where you tithe and where you give. I would just suggest, though, that when tithing was first introduced in Scripture, it was in Genesis 11, and Abraham was coming across the plains, met by the high priest Melchizedek from Salem, and Abraham gave him a tenth of all of his booty and loot that he had gotten in rescuing his son Lot. And Melchizedek blessed him. The point, and that's the first instance of tithing. And it's always important to note when you look through scriptures and you see the first instance of something, God is defining the scope of something there. And God spoke to me one time about this, and he said, did you notice that Abraham gave the tithe, and Melchizedek is noted as a type and a shadow of Jesus. So Abraham gave the tithe where he met God, where he was in the presence. So I see that as we give to our local church because that's where we go, and that's where we find the presence of God in fellow believers, and that's where we find the presence of God in our worship. And in fact, it's the presence of God that brought us to a commitment to a local church. So I'll just mention that. No debt. That is definitely a godly endeavor. We read in Proverbs that the rich rule over the poor, and the lender is, or the borrower is servant to the lender. And God does not want us to be in a servant position. We are in an heir, an inheritance position. We are heirs. We are stewards of the riches of the cattle on 1,000 hills that he has. It is all the Lord's, and as an inheritance, we are stewards of that, and we should not be in debt to anyone other than our relationship with the Lord. The exception to that is the mortgage, just because a lot of people, they're not going to save up a whole amount, although it would be good, and it's been done, to purchase a house. I'll just share a quick anecdote that somebody that took the financial peace classes from Dave Ramsey shared with Dave. He was a young man. He had graduated from college. And while he was putting himself through college, he didn't take any student loans. He didn't take any debt. And he was not a student of Dave Ramsey. He was a student of his grandfather that taught him these things. You don't take any debt. And so to put himself through college, he lived in a small apartment that was above a garage on a larger estate for a very elderly woman. And he took care of her house, mowed the lawn, and did the maintenance work on the house for her, for which consideration he got was the ability to live above the garage without making any payments. He got married right out of college, and he landed a great job where he was making about $70,000 a year. And he moved his wife into the apartment above the garage. And he suffered no small amount of abuse from her family. What are you doing to our daughter? You've got this great job. You're making her live in this. She can't buy furniture. All of these kind of things. And what is our daughter in for? And do you really know what you're doing? He saved of his 70, except for taxes and what they used for living. In the period of 3 years, he saved $120,000. And in addition to that, another $15,000. He took the $120,000, went out and bought a house with cash, and then gave his wife the $15,000 and said, you can furnish it. So the question then to the in-laws is, so who is the one here with the wisdom? Now, not only that they have a house paid for, and this is the way to do it. You don't have to go out and buy a big car. You can go out and you can buy the car for $1,500. That'll get you back and forth to work. And while you're doing that, you save up. And then you've got $10,000. You sell the $1,500 car, which still may be worth $1,200. Down payment plus you've saved up. Now you have a $12,000 car, really nice car. It's going to last a couple of years, and you save up. Then you can buy the car you want, but because you're making payments into a savings account instead of to a bank, and the car costs you exactly what you pay cash and not 2.5 times because of all the interest. This is godly wisdom. No debt, with the exception of the mortgage. So the idea here is once you've tackled all your debt and you're doing these other things, that anything above that 15%, you're putting on the mortgage to pay off your home mortgage early. And people can usually do that 7, 8 years instead of 30. So the other thing that's very important is having 3 to 6 months of living expenses in an emergency fund. And what that does is that provides security. That emergency fund is insurance. And we can look at the Proverbs around that wisdom. Proverbs says, a wise man sees danger ahead and moves himself out of the way, where the foolish rush into it. We protect ourselves. You don't know what's going to happen. The economy go bad. The company you work for go out of business. You don't know. This makes you recession-proof. You've got time to find the job. Within 3 to 6 months, you found another job. You start building this back up again. Sure, it got depleted, and you're building it back up again, but just think if you didn't have that. That's the blessing, is that you have that. The next, regardless of your income on all of this, 15% to go into investing, and that right there is what builds wealth and allows people to retire as millionaires. And to pass on, and this is also in Proverbs, investing in developing wealth is not an evil thing. Proverbs says the wise man leaves an inheritance to his children and his children's children. God wants us to prosper. God has given us inheritance. He's made us stewards over the cattle on 1,000 hills, and he wants us to do this through investing. Finally, this last item, it's a funny name, and it's called sinking funds where they are necessary. Usually in households, you may not have need for a sinking fund, but I'll tell you what it is, and then you can see that it may or may not apply to certain situations. So somebody buys an investment property, and it's a warehouse. And in this warehouse, they've got trucks that line up. And store things in the warehouse. And say whatever the operating cost is on the warehouse, you're running this business. There is a need for maintenance to keep the warehouse operating. And say that the roof that was just replaced on this warehouse is what you might call a 20-year roof. So people that do commercial roofing, they'll say that you've got a 20-year roof. So maintenance before 20 years is minor, and you can handle those things with your emergency fund. Replacing that is going to cost big dollars. So what the sinking fund does, and we say that's on 20 years, what a sinking fund does is total cost of replacing the roof, say it was $57,000. Very simply, you take $57,000, divide it by 20, and that much has to go into the sinking fund every year. The purpose for that is if you've put 20% of the cost of the roof into a sinking fund every year, when it's time to replace that roof, you have a fully vested, a full amount of money to replace that roof. It's a way of leveling off your expenses and your income. So, and it's another way to wisely use what comes in rather than spending everything that goes out. Again, another Proverbs for that is the rich man, or the wise man has stores of oil and riches, where the foolish spends everything he has. So the idea here is you're planning with wisdom to manage all of these finances, that you're not going to get caught in a situation. Had another thought on that. So do you understand what a sinking fund is? All right. Let me pull this off of here. So let's talk about, if this is the goal and we're not at that goal, how do we get to the goal? So what we do when we're moving to the goal is, again, because it colors our character and it identifies who we are, we keep up with the tithing. The debt, maybe we have 3-4 credit cards, we have a car payment, we have other things that we have to pay, that we want to, this is important to attack that debt first. Very important. So instead of 3 to 6 of living expenses, while we're moving towards that goal, the emergency fund depending on what your monthly living expenses are, could be anywhere from $500 to $1,500. And that'll change as the cost of living changes over time. But $100 gives you an emergency fund that if the water pump goes out in the car, if the water heater in the house blows up and you have to replace it, you've kind of got that covered, and it doesn't set everything back, and you don't have to use a credit card to try to recover from that. And then while you keep this emergency fund at that amount, that you also do not do any investing. So there's no investing at this time, that debt. Be aware, if you need a sinking fund, make sure that's in the budget, because anything that needs a sinking fund will come along just like an emergency then, and you have to be able to handle it. But without investing and without the emergency fund, then everything that you have, you take and start attacking that debt. The whole purpose of this is okay. So I'll show you, if you have 4 or 5 different items that are debts that you're paying off, a way of paying them off that has worked very, very well for thousands and thousands and thousands of people. Heard this expression. Susie Orman uses it. Dave Ramsey uses it. Several people do. It's something called the debt snowball. I'll show you how that works. So, what the idea here is to list your debts in the amount that you have $550 that you owe to a department store. Okay? And oops, let me right up here. This is the balance, and the monthly payment. Say the monthly payment is then, in addition to Kohl's, say that you have $1,200 that you owe to on a Visa card, and the monthly payment there, say, is $45. And in addition to those, let's say that there's $5,200 that you owe Dave Ramsey calls Fannie Mae that aunt that lives in the back bedroom and never moves out. And Fannie Mae, because the way they structure these things, and it's why she never moves out, they only want $35 a month. And you can see it's going to take forever to get rid of Fannie Mae. So then finally, you have $1,500 on an auto loan. And the payment there is $220 a month. So all of that, let's see what that adds up to. That's 10, 8, 9, 10, 11, 13. Tell me if my math is going to be wrong here. I get $330. Is that about right? $255? Yes, $330. Okay. All right. So when we're doing the things we talked and we've got the emergency fund in place, and it's important, before you start doing a debt snowball, get the $1,500 in the emergency fund first, because you never know when Murphy's going to show up. So, our debt, this is called our debt service. This is what it takes to service the debt we have. In our budget, we have, and while we're doing this, we're leaving on and have as much available as we can to pay these off. So while we're doing that, we have, let's say we have 500. Let me write that up here. 500 available to pay on this. The way the debt snowball works is you come down, and every month from the 500, you have 107. So what you do is you take that 170 and you start paying on Kohl's. And you can see by paying $170 in addition to the 30, you're paying $200 a month. It's going to take you less than 3 months, and that bad boy is going to go away. So then, once the Kohl's is paid off, you take that 30, add it to what's available, and it now becomes 2. With our regular, now we're paying $245 to Visa, and that's going to be paid off in 5 months. Just 5 months, and off it goes. Then we take the $245 along with 35, and that's $280. $280 to pay Fannie Mae. It'll be, I'm guessing, 18 months. I don't know, something like doing all the math. But then that's going to be paid off. So that's in about a 2-year period. We've knocked all of those off. Then we take the 280 plus the 220, and that gives us $500 to pay on our car payment. And $500, 20 to 23 months. So if you got a 5-year car loan, you'll be paying it off in about 2.5 years, in about half the time. And once all of that's done, then you take the 500 with, and you start building up your living expenses because you've got your debts paid off except the mortgage. Then you start building the living expenses. Once those are up, then you start putting in investing. And when you've reached 15% of your income that you're putting in investing, extra goes back against the mortgage. Eventually the mortgage is paid off early. Then you really start building investment income, and you build wealth. And because you tightened your belt and lived on beans and rice and beans to do this, there's an expression for this. Most people won't do that because I deserve to go out to a good restaurant every once in a while. But when you're paying off the debts and you're focusing on it, the expression is, you're not normal, you're weird, and you live like nobody else. And the reason why? So that once all of this is paid off and you've built up wealth, then you can live like nobody. So all the people that are in the middle of this and on the treadmill are stuck living paycheck to paycheck. But the people that break that mold and use the wisdom of God's planning get to a point where they discipline themselves, live like nobody else, and then realize the wealth that God has intended for them, and they live like nobody else. Any questions on any. Again, sinking funds aren't always, one thing I could think of is when Terry and I were first married, we had, for instance, the mortgage at that time didn't include things like the property taxes. So every year we had to come up with our property taxes, and we had to save every month, put it in so that when the end of the year came and it was necessary, we could pay it. And again, this is not doing things from a do-get, but rather it's living in our identity, in the wisdom God's given us, so that we have the ability to have a foundation of financial prosperity. All righty. That's pretty much all I have for tonight. Oh, I do want to mention, and especially anybody that's listening on YouTube or listens at a later time, Terry and I have completely given our hearts to godly financial planning and helping other people with it. She and I have been hosting and teaching Dave Ramsey classes and these principles for about 12 years now. I did it at the church we attended in Dallas, and once I got on fire with that, I took it to the company I worked for at the time, and they liked it so much they were flying me between Dallas and Houston at their two major facilities to teach the classes every week for them. And this kind of financial piece, because businesses understand that when their employees are not living paycheck to paycheck and they don't have that stress and that anxiety, that they're better employees. And so they actually provided the facilities, they contributed to the materials, etc., to do the classes. And I say all that to say this, that anytime anybody would like help with budgeting, planning, and myself are always available. And in fact, we have been doing some financial counseling with some people here at church. And we love doing it because it's in our hearts. So I'll leave it at that. And I want to close with prayer. I'll mention that we have the basket in the kiosk and back, and also those that are online. If you go to spiritandlifesa.com, there is a donation button for PayPal there, and you can make donations online. So, Lord, I just close tonight. We thank you for all of this information. We ask you that, Lord, that my thoughts and my words wouldn't go forth from this, but, Lord, that your wisdom, that in whatever way my thoughts and words were a trigger to carry the seeds of your wisdom, that wisdom that you had with the Father before the worlds were created. We ask that to be planted deep in our hearts, and we ask that our hearts be tilled and plowed and furrowed, that wisdom can grow, and that we can be a nation of priests that lives like nobody else. Thank you, Lord. Amen.